One of the most important aspects to any future war is that of intelligence. China has been at the forefront of digital espionage against the United States. It's a game of spy versus spy, but who will end up with the upper hand? This is Military Matters. Want to keep your dollars and cents? Then download the Sense app from the Office of Financial Readiness. That's Sense, S-E-N, $E, to save for retirement, build credit, create a spending plan, or buying a home. You can't do any of those things without money. So if you have sense, you'll download the Sense app. That's S-E-N, $E, today. And be sure to follow at DoD FinRed on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. In our last episode, we discussed the rise of China and how today's geopolitical landscape has become something of a powder keg. In this episode, Jack Murphy takes us into the world of Chinese espionage, a world that perhaps didn't start off the way you might think, and has come to a point where even our SF-86 data, the information used for security clearances, isn't safe from Chinese hackers. Jack Murphy explains more.
The rise of China is perhaps the most important geostrategic development of the 21st century. With that, of course, comes talk of the Chinese threat, in air quotes. Call it what you want, but a rising superpower is naturally going to challenge the influence and reach of the existing one. One of the ways that America and China will compete and seek advantage over one another is by spying on each other. The U.S. federal government has accused or convicted dozens of people of spying on behalf of China in recent years. And this is really just a drop in the bucket when it comes to their overall intelligence collection efforts. The spy games are escalating in tandem with China's rise to global prominence. Alexander Yuk Ching Ma was a CIA officer arrested in 2020 on the accusation of spying for China. His case is still pending in court. Another CIA officer, Jerry Chung Xing Li, was convicted in 2019 of spying for China. Meanwhile, the CIA's own operations have been dismantled in China in recent years. In 2017, the press reported that the CIA's clandestine comm system used to communicate with Chinese assets had been compromised, leading to the imprisonment or death of up to 20 individuals who had been providing America's intelligence officers with information. With all this spy versus spy, one can't help but think that we're heading into a new type of Cold War. To get some professional insight into the subject of Chinese espionage directed against the United States, I reached out to Matthew Brazil.
My background is starting off as a soldier. I was an MI officer, an intelligence officer in the Army. And from there, went on to continue studying China. I actually started when I was a kid in the San Francisco Bay Area, being very interested in China. But fast forwarding as quickly as I can, I continued the study of China through graduate work and did China work for a small police agency in the Commerce Department called the Office of Export Enforcement that does technology diversion investigations. They're still around, going strong. Then I was picked up by the Foreign Commercial Service to go to China in the years right after the Tiananmen Square incident. Did export control work as well as export promotion work there, and then was picked up by a U.S. company with a lot of business in Asia to do investigations on the ground of threats to the company, including intellectual property theft and different thefts of other sorts and threats against people. And I ended up continuing to do other industrial security work until I began this book project a couple of years ago.
Matthew is the author of Chinese Communist Espionage, co-authored with Peter Mattis. Let's start at the beginning with the birth of Chinese espionage and beginning to walk this subject forward chronologically.
Back in dynastic times, that is before 1911, the fall of the Qing dynasty, 1911 and 12. In the last couple hundred years of the Qing dynasty, that last dynasty, there was only limited interest in the outside world, and there was not much of a threat from the ocean, so to speak, from the east. until the mid 19th century. And the Qing dynasty was accustomed to not making a big effort to gather intelligence about potential opponents, although they did some efforts. But going into the 20th century, when China was broken apart, again, there was not much in place, and the Chinese Communist Party was not really much for intelligence work. And one of their luminaries, named Chen Yun, said that the party did not really appreciate intelligence work until 1927, when they were attacked by the Nationalist Party, their erstwhile partners, to try to bring China back on its feet after decades and decades of imperialist invasion and exploitation and so on. But beginning then, in 1927, when the party recognized that they needed something like that, something like intelligence and protection work, it became a core business very quickly over the course of the following decades. And when I say that, I'm saying that because in their liaison offices during the anti-Japanese War, in other words, World War II, at their liaison offices, which later became the model for their embassies and consulates overseas, the main players in those offices were the organization department, which is like HR++ in the Chinese Communist Party. It's one of the most powerful organizations in the party. It does all the assignments and so forth. The propaganda department was also represented, also a very major concern for the Chinese communists, since they want to control the narrative so that people go along with their program more readily. And the military department, of course, which supervised the army. And so Chinese Communist Intelligence, with its various names, the Special Services Branch, and later on the Social Affairs Department, all the way to 1949 at the Communist victory, were central, one of the four central offices there. And indeed, after the Declaration of the People's Republic in 1949, the intelligence organization, which was a bit disorganized, partly because of the Korean War and partly for other reasons, was also a major player, but they suddenly became very dark, very secret. It was not known really what they were doing or who they really were by Western analysts, although the nationalists who retreated to Taiwan did know something about them. And going through the 1950s, they began to organize themselves into an actual intelligence community with regular conferences to discuss turf and other matters between the military intelligence arm and various departments of the Communist Party, including the Central Investigations Department, which became the post-1949 intelligence agency. But along came the Cultural Revolution, and everything was blown up.
According to Matthew, the Cultural Revolution also crushed China's intelligence gathering capability, which then had to be rebuilt.
The intelligence effort of the party was not spared in the Cultural Revolution. It was broken apart and then put back together. It was first under the military, but it did survive and became important once again when Mao Zedong was seriously considering opening up to the Americans, which culminated, of course, in Richard Nixon's 1972 visit and the establishment of unofficial relations in order to balance Soviet power. And from then on until the end of the Cold War and a little bit beyond, the United States and China had a common interest in understanding what was going on in the Soviet Union, and there were regular exchanges concerning that, intelligence type exchanges. But then with the opening of Deng Xiaoping that he engineered, there were more and more foreigners in China, where before there really hadn't been many. Even at the height of the Soviet friendship period, there were maybe 6,000 or 8,000 Russians in China. But now there were tens of thousands growing into hundreds of thousands year by year. And this was alarming because all of a sudden there was more money in society. All of a sudden there were more foreigners in society. And Deng Xiaoping became concerned about this, and he ended up starting up the Ministry of State Security, which exists even today. And over time, they have evolved slowly from being a mostly counterintelligence, counterespionage organization in China to doing more and more foreign intelligence work. And that's especially true in the last 15 years, particularly beginning about 2005, as Peter Mattis has pointed out, when cyber intelligence became a thing and was better and better coordinated with other forms, other intelligence disciplines, such as human intelligence. And so Nowadays, Ministry of State Security people are not a bunch of thugs who don't speak anything but Chinese. Now, we still have those, and I've encountered some when I was doing business in China, people who knock on the door of the factory where a foreigner is working and demand that you come down to their dungeon to discuss this or that, which has happened to me. And I refuse, telling them I like coffee better than dungeons. So we're going to a coffee shop. I could get away with that because I'm an American. To be blunt, I'm from a powerful country, and I was employed by a multinational corporation that the Chinese considered to be important to their modernization. So I could get away with being a smart aleck like that, but the average foreigner cannot. And anyway, nowadays, the State Security Ministry is recruiting more and more people, younger people who have a language, a foreign language, or a language of concern like Uyghur or Tibetan, and they are becoming more competent at foreign intelligence operations.
That's an amazing summary. I think that getting up into, I'd like to kind of focus on the last decade or two about how they have evolved and how they have, the Chinese government has expanded external operations. That's not just cyber operations, that we hear about these people moving around outside U.S. military bases, taking photographs. And I'd like to talk about that. And I'd also like to talk about these different approaches or different thoughts about how Chinese espionage works. There are some people who talk about, grains of sand and the intelligence mosaic, and they use library science to correlate information. But then there's the other view that actually they do have what we would think of as case officers who handle assets, manage assets, and task them with various intelligence requirements they have.
Yeah, well, let's handle the dingbats first.
Sure.
The unfortunate people who decide they're going to do something really dumb, like walk up to the fence of a Navy base in the Florida Keys and try to tunnel under it or walk around it or something and take pictures and so on, things that make no sense. I think, of course, the jury is out as far as actual proof about who these people are, but these are not professional operations at all. And I doubt, although I can't prove it, that these are operations that are directed by an intelligence officer. Instead, these seem to be incidents that are carried out by people who have a sudden desire to serve the motherland, and they don't talk to anybody about it, not even their parents. They just go ahead and do something, and they get caught. Now, then there's another case that's been talked about in the media a great deal about Christine Fung, who was a student at Cal State East Bay in Hayward, California, and was being run by a state security officer based at the Chinese consulate San Francisco. And for some reason known only to Lenin and God, she met her controller in public where they could be observed by the FBI, who of course follow around state security officers. And if the Chinese didn't know that, then I'm not sure what to think. But that was particularly sloppy. It probably doesn't represent the whole enchilada, so to speak. It probably is an example of a less skilled officer making a sloppy mistake. But there are also efforts, some of which originate in China, where it seems like MSS is still most comfortable operating, where a foreigner who's resident in China is recruited there. Of course, doing a recruitment in China is far more secure, and it can be done by people who don't necessarily have to have plenty of foreign language skills. They can recruit somebody to control it by a professional officer. One of the most famous examples of that, of course, is Glenn Duffy Shriver, who almost 15 years ago now, I suppose, was recruited by a newspaper ad in Shanghai to write about international affairs and get a lot of money for it. And indeed, I recently spoke to a very young person who works in Washington, D.C., who was approached in that very same way in Beijing by the Beijing State Security $1,000 to write about international affairs, with the idea that they would be cultivated, assessed, eventually recruited if the assessment went well, and that they would go to the United States and try to get a job in a government agency. And of course, the people who are being targeted for this are people who are not necessarily studying Chinese music of the Ming Dynasty or anything like that. They're studying things like political science and history. In other words, they fit the profile that would be suitable for being hired into a government agency, being given a security clearance and work on China.
And that's really playing the long game. I mean, that's like recruiting somebody, a kid on the street, and then putting them into the military thinking that, yeah, they could become a general one day.
Back to the issue of the two different views that some analysts have about Chinese espionage or Chinese intelligence collection, that some people, the sort of grains of sand approach that they just send out an abundance of collectors all around the world, and then they bring little bits and pieces of information back that's assembled into a mosaic, a sort of a gestalt, if you will, back home. How do you assess that versus more traditional recruiting assets or whatever methodology they're going to use to actually collect what we would think of as like actionable strategic intelligence?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the jury, in my opinion, is kind of still out on that. Now, Peter Mattis and I very much disagree with the grains of sand idea, but to enable listeners to weigh this for themselves, they should take a look at the writings by Nicholas Eftimiades.
Yeah, I think Chinese Espionage is the name of the book.
Yeah, his book from 1994, and he's just put out another book too that was privately produced. But Nick is more of the opinion that grains of sand is a legitimate idea, and he points to the reality that there are a lot of students in the United States who are from China, and that it's true that the Chinese government can approach anybody who is going overseas. As a Ministry of Public Security officer once said years ago, the students going overseas or Chinese living overseas are like a kite. They may be flying free up there, but they have a string that goes back down to the ground, and that's China. So they can be manipulated through their relatives. But that's all true. I buy off on that. It's absolutely a legitimate idea. Where I think the jury is still out is to what extent such recruitments are made. Because if I look at Chinese Communist history, the party has always considered the Chinese society to be full of enemies. They have words that describe this. They refer to the masses like the Russians did, like Lenin did, the Chunzhong. The masses are everybody, but Renmin, the people, are a portion of the masses. The people are the people who do not oppose the Communist Party and indeed, at least tacitly, support it. The people who we serve. We don't serve the masses, we serve the people if we're the Chinese Communist Party. And so since they consider society, they've always considered society to be full of enemies. They've had campaign after campaign, political campaigns against enemies in society beginning in 1950, the first year of the People's Republic, moving all the way through Deng Xiaoping's time when he said, no more campaigns. We're not going to do that Maoist stuff anymore, that Mao thought stuff anymore. However, at the same time, there are still campaigns going on, really. There's been an anti-spy campaign that's now in its 7th year that targets Chinese people who deal too much with foreigners. And so since they consider society to be full of unreliable people and potential enemies, they're not just going to recruit anybody, because when they recruit somebody, they don't want them to go over to the other side and give it all away. Now, there's a counter argument to that is made by Nick and others, that they're taking a sort of a human wave approach to this. And I think that's a legitimate idea, but I don't think there's enough evidence really to call it a valid theory. So I think the jury is still out on this. And of course, one of the problems with that idea, the grains of sand idea, is that it causes people in the United States to consider anybody who's ethnic Chinese to be a potential spy. And this is not the kind of thing that we've really done before with ethnic groups other than those that are from Asia, starting with the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s. We've had a very allergic reaction to people from Asia, and it's something I think we need to get over.
You mean that we should be more aggressive with the Chinese, with the espionage threat itself?
I think that for starters, the FBI needs to change its approach a bit, needs to fine-tune its approach. Its agents who do foreign counterintelligence work are typically not trained in the Chinese language, nor are they typically trained in any sort of area studies like the military does. The military, our military, has foreign area officers. They'll identify an officer who has potential to do additional work of that sort, and they'll put him through foreign language training at the Defense Language Institute, and they'll send him off for a year to do a master's degree in area studies on Russia, China, or wherever. And so then these people are sent on assignments that are relevant to that course of study. But the Bureau does not do that. And in order to be able to do that, they would have to basically go to Congress, say we need 20 or 30% more agents in foreign counterintelligence. We need to have money to train them at the Foreign Service Institute or at DLI, the Defense Language Institute, and money to send them off to get a master's degree in East Asian studies somewhere. And then they would be much more independent. They would be much more competent, I think, in handling Chinese people. But as it is, they rely on people who are not familiar with China or Asia or any other part of the world necessarily to do the field work and to rely on language specialists to do translations. But seriously, that's just not enough. We need to change that approach if we're going to be able to more competently handle the threat of Chinese espionage on our soil.
And then what's the counter argument to the grains of sand or the human wave approach that you mentioned that Peter Mattis would make about Chinese intelligence?
Well, I hope I can do it justice. The counter argument that I think either one of us would make is that whenever people talk about grains of sand, quite often they write about it and they'll start citing cases that are not grains of sand type cases. These are cases where a Chinese person, was recruited by a professional intelligence officer, or where a foreigner, an American, is recruited by either a cutout person like Guo Taishan is an example, who was originally from Taiwan, but was recruited by Chinese Communist Intelligence, and he recruited a couple of Americans with security clearance to pass secrets onto him, through him, onto the Ministry of State Security. It's funny, they'll talk about grains of sand and they'll say that there are all these people, thousands and thousands of people, and they're shipping off secrets that are winnowed out in Beijing. But then they start citing these cases that involve actual tradecraft, actual intelligence officers, and people who are carefully recruited. So I think that's the crux of the argument, really.
That they do, in fact, have more of a traditional espionage program as, practiced by Americans, Europeans, like MI6, MI5, CIA, that they do engage in those types of operations.
Yes, that they do. But the thing that makes it a confusing picture is that they do that. They have those efforts. They follow standard type tradecraft. But at the same time, they're doing other things too. So at the same time, they are trying to recruit students who are going to the United States or someplace else where there's the kind of technology they might want. And they say to them, you're so lucky to be going overseas and have this opportunity to serve your country. So while you are there, pay attention to this, that, and the other thing. And when you come home at Chinese New Year or over the October 1st holiday to see your family, then we're going to want to talk to you. So that's the kind of thing that CIA used to do. They used to approach business during the Cold War when it was really difficult to get information out of the Soviet Union or China. They used to approach business people and ask them if they wanted to help in the national defense, et cetera, and tell them what we're interested in Russia, and then go ahead and give that a try. Watch out for this, watch out for that. Then when you come back from your business trip, don't try anything funny. Don't try to be a spy. Just keep your eyes open, your ears open. when you come back, tell us what you found out. An exception to that, of course, is there's a new movie out about Grenville Wynne, the British citizen who was recruited in the early 60s to handle Penkovsky, the great spy, who was a Soviet military officer who gave the United States and Britain information that was crucial during the Cuban Missile Crisis. As depicted in the movie, he was totally gobsmacked, to use a British phrase, at the idea of doing this dangerous work, but he decided to go ahead and do it. He was caught, and he ended up doing some time in prison in the Soviet Union. Fortunately, he was not shot.
Are you a military spouse? MilSpouse Money Mission educates and empowers those whom service members rely on most. So if you're the household 6, captain of the homestead, leader of the domicile, check out MilSpouse Money Mission from the Office of Financial Readiness. Also, they have an app, Sense app. SEN money sign E to save for retirement, build credit, create a spending plan, or buying a home. If the last year taught us anything, it was how important it is to save for a rainy day or a COVID year. So if you have any sense, you'll download the Sense app. That's SEN money sign E today. And be sure to follow at DoD FinRed on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube.
I wanted to ask Matthew, though, how does he assess the overall Chinese espionage threat directed against the United States?
Well, when it comes to technology acquisition, I think that they have improved the game a great deal compared to the old KGB efforts to collect and Eastern European Warsaw Pact efforts to collect technology from the United States and other advanced industrial countries. In part, this is because China is a better receptor for advanced technology. It's sort of like, yes, the Vikings came to North America before Columbus, but what did they do? Like nothing. Columbus was the beginning of the avalanche that resulted in the European settlement of the Americas. And so the Chinese, compared to the Russians, are sort of in a similar position. They are an advanced economy. They become an advanced economy thanks to membership in the World Trade Organization and a lot of free trade with the United States, loosening of export controls. And so now they have a very advanced economy. They are nose to nose with us on artificial intelligence. They are ahead of us in telecommunications, 5G technology. I mean, American companies pretend to have 5G in their advertisements, but it's laughable compared to what the Chinese are doing with Huawei and advanced telecommunications in the palm of your hand. And this is why, of course, we can't even convince the British to not adopt Huawei technology. And it's hard to convince localities in the United States not to adopt cheap Huawei 5G technology, even though it's easier for us overall compared to other places. But Huawei is, sad to say, taking the globe by storm when it comes to this sort of thing. So the market for stolen technology that is of military use, or just as importantly, of specific use in the latest PRC 5-year plan, because they're still a socialist country when it comes to things like that, planning the economy and such. They may have lots of capitalist type businesses, but the dominant player in the economy is still the state. So they become really good at stealing technology. And another thing that contributes to the grains of sand idea is that there are a lot of independent players out there, people who come to the United States, do a graduate degree, work for a few years someplace in a lab, then get the idea that, you know what, I could take this stuff back to China and start my own company. Well, they're doing that on their own quite often. And there are a number of cases like that in our book that are outlined. No intelligence officer involved, as far as anybody can tell. And there are a lot of other cases too, where somebody with enough technical knowledge decides to start their own business, and they're buying militarily usable technology as an American company, and they're shipping it off to China manifested as bananas. I'm kind of making a joke out of it, but basically they're doing false manifests to ship stuff overseas. This is a very classic technique. So these people are they might be working with the Ministry of State Security, but they might be working with some institute somewhere that's trying to get the technology on its own.
Then there's China's 1,000 Talents program.
That program gives money to institutes and universities to go out and find foreign talent, or of course, overseas Chinese talent. Probably 80% or more of what they bring home is overseas Chinese talent. Gives them enough money to offer attractive salaries to come back to China and teach or develop sensitive technology for the state. And so these two are not necessarily controlled or even associated with the state security or the PLA Intelligence Bureau, which is the military intelligence arm that does human intelligence operations overseas. But again, there's a lot more research that needs to be done to more precisely define these efforts.
In 2014 and 2015, the U.S. Office of Personnel Management, or OPM, got hacked. That's why all of us who hold security clearances, or used to, received a lovely letter from the United States government about how all of our personal information from the SF-86 forms we filled out was stolen by the Chinese government. I asked Matthew what the real implications from these types of data breaches are for American security.
Yeah, not only that, but they have gotten their hands on information from airlines and credit agencies and hotels. And it's very interesting. You know, traditionally from the early history of the People's Republic, things that would not be considered secret by us, agricultural data, et cetera, were classified by the Chinese side. And if it wasn't classified, then it was designated as basically the Chinese equivalent of for official use only, internal use, 内部 in Chinese. And why did they do that? Well, in part, it was because of the requirements of a socialist system that relies on propaganda in order to maintain peace and security and the loyalty of the population. Because if the American media was allowed to sell the International Herald Tribune on the streets of Beijing, like the China Daily is sold on the streets of San Jose, California, where I live, not to mention other places, that would be a problem because that would be contradicting what the state is telling Chinese media to say about the world. And we don't have that, of course. We believe in free exchange of information, open government to the extent we can, and so forth, because we're not afraid of so much of the truth. Of course, we have our problems, but we're not at all at the same end of the spectrum as the Russians and the Chinese. And from the beginning of the wide use of the World Wide Web, the internet, the Chinese were able to control it. They started off with 6 gateways into China, and they had people at each gateway who were in the early days, in the early 2000s, who were controlling, in the 90s, who were controlling what came in and out, who were grabbing web searches that didn't meet the strictures of the state. And then, of course, they began to find ways to better control the internet. And today, they pretty much have it locked down, except for people who can use the right kind of virtual private network or VPN. Even that is sometimes difficult. People get away with it still. People get away with using VPNs, downloading them and employing them to get beyond the so-called Great Firewall. But occasionally people, and I've actually seen some documents here, occasionally people are caught and they're given a big fine and slapped on the wrist. So far as I know, in main Han China, where Han people live, that is the majority, 94% or so of people in China, the ethnic majority, they typically are not punished severely. However, then there's Tibet and Xinjiang, where the lockdown is much more extensive for the web, and you get in trouble if you don't have the right spy app on your phone and the police catch you, then off you go to detention or worse. So they really want to control that information, trivial information, geologic data, harvest data even. And that's something we don't do. Now, to circle back to your question, of course, it's illegal to hack into somebody's network and steal all the hotel reservation information and all the personally identifiable information that goes with it. But in general, we're very open with this stuff. And I think the most critical part of this whole thing is part of it is having lots of information to potentially recruit Americans who travel to China or who are even approached here in the United States by an intelligence officer. But another part of it that isn't discussed very much is that this massive data, when it's attacked by artificial intelligence, there is the possibility, there is the potential of using it to develop a much more sophisticated understanding of American society and of the vulnerabilities of our industrial infrastructure and other matters. And this is something where, personally speaking, I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop to see what they're able to do if they are successful in developing a super sophisticated picture of how our society, our infrastructure, our population shifts, et cetera, how it all works. It could be weaponized. And I think we just have to wait and see about that.
This actually leads me right into the next topic. Are you seeing any indicators that Chinese espionage, that one of their goals is what we would call operational preparation of the battlefield, that they are preparing for an armed conflict?
In the open press and even on YouTube, you can find people talking about that kind of thing, talking about how I remember there was a YouTube lecture. I'm afraid the name escapes me right now. But he was talking. I don't mean to be political here, but this is what he said. He said that with Trump as president, we don't have that much to worry about. There's not going to be, if we need to move against Taiwan, there's probably not going to be any big problem. If we need to move against Japan and take back the Diaoyutai Islands, which the Japanese call the Senkakus, no problem. Now, of course, that's one person talking on YouTube, which is banned in China. But and he's still out there. And so if that was heresy, if it was a message that the party did not want people overseas to hear, at least with the thin veil of the Chinese language, it would have been pulled, but it was never pulled. I'm not a military specialist, so it's hard for me to speak to that question specifically, but the indications that I see just as a casual observer of military affairs indicates that there have been a lot more exercises that simulate the type of operations that would have to be pursued in order to scare off the Americans and intimidate Taiwan, at least. The Jamestown Foundation and I did a paper, which is available at jamestown.org. The title of the paper is called The Prize, and it's a long study, about 20 pages long, that talks about the possibility of the PLA moving against Taiwan and what they really want from Taiwan. And what they, according to their writings, what they really want, of course, is not to bomb the hell out of Taiwan and take its charred remains for the motherland. What they really want is to convince the population, the voting public, that resistance is futile, and they want to be able to attract Taiwan back to the mainland without firing a shot, not only because it's very important to the Chinese national self-image to recover this, quote, recover, unquote, Taiwan, which has never been under communist rule at all, but also, of course, to obtain their semiconductor manufacturing facilities, which right now TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Corporation, has manufacturing capability to assemble circuits with on a silicon chip with lithography that goes down to 4 nanometers in between circuit widths, which means that you can put a lot more on a chip. That's important because if you don't have to rely on a circuit board, to get technical for a second, if you don't have to rely on a circuit board to have all the different components of the guidance system for a missile, let's say, if you've got them all together on a chip, they can go much faster because the distance is shrunk by 100 times. So having that kind of advanced capability is something that has typically eluded China. They've made progress, but they're nowhere near where the West is and where Taiwan is. So this is why there's been all this talk about if Taiwan fell, then worldwide manufacturing would be in a lot of trouble. And indeed it would, because so much now, everything practically that surrounds us uses microchips.
I mean, do you think that's a realistic policy ambition by the Chinese? I mean, isn't Taiwanese nationalism? I mean, it's hard to see Taiwan like flipping and sort of like a Hong Kong type situation happening there.
Well, there are occasionally statements by people in Washington that indicate that maybe this isn't really a core interest of the United States, that we should possibly get into a world war to solve. Even as far back as 1997 or 98, I recall reading about a Chinese general who was visiting the Americans, commenting that you are probably not willing to trade Los Angeles for Taipei. And of course, there's some truth to that. In the United States, I don't think we have reached a national consensus really about what to do if there was a sudden severe threat against Taiwan, because things are different now. It used to be that we could make a not so subtle threat by sending aircraft carriers to the Taiwan Straits, and this would be a warning to the Chinese side, and they'd back off. Like during the Reagan administration, this sort of thing happened, and also during all the way through the Clinton administration. But now, of course, the Chinese side has made really big advances in missile technology, in SRBMs, short-range ballistic missiles, in MRBMs, and they can threaten any carrier force that goes west of Guam. So this is a serious issue, and we have not reached a consensus, I think, on how to handle it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, 50,000 something soldiers died in Vietnam over the course of that conflict, which was very controversial. If something happened in the South China Sea and 10,000 American troops are killed in the first 48 hours, you have to wonder how the public would respond to something like that.
Yeah. The question is, do we have a greatest generation right now? I don't know.
Right. And it's so hard to have a national consensus. I mean, most people probably have no idea. They don't understand any of these dynamics we're speaking of, don't know where Taiwan is on a map. And we can't even get the country to agree to wear, masks during a pandemic. So it just seems like it'd be very difficult to galvanize the public towards these sorts of like large military or policy objectives nowadays. So the other thing, since this podcast is very much geared towards the military and the troops out there, the veterans, I wanted to ask you specifically about the types of Chinese espionage threats directed against the United States military and how the military can guard against it, even how the individual soldier, what they should be aware of, what they should be looking for potentially if they're being targeted or the office or the installation where they work is being targeted.
Finally, I asked Matthew how seriously we should be taking the threat of Chinese espionage as a credible threat to our country.
Well, it's I would say it's not a cockroach crawling up your arm and getting ready to go for your jugular. It's spying, and it doesn't mean it's not important. It just means it's not going to destroy us in all likelihood, and we shouldn't panic about it. We especially should avoid having a knee-jerk allergic reaction to this sort of problem. It's something we need to study more about. It's something we need to understand more. We need to do better counterintelligence work than we have been doing. I mean, I don't mean to riff the Bureau here, the FBI, because of course they're very dedicated people. They know what they're doing. They've tackled a lot of cases that are important. They've made a lot of important arrests. I'm just saying that they need to do the same thing that the military does and train people in area studies. But beyond that, it's really important that we recognize that ethnic Chinese people, Asian people are loyal American citizens. And people who come here, who are visitors, who are students, they're not all spies. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the Chinese and the Russians have been spying on us just like we've been spying on them for decades. We are always going to have moles inside the Chinese government. The Chinese and the Russians are always going to have moles inside of our government. This is just a fact of life. And this is why we have a strong counterintelligence effort. And we shouldn't be panicking about this. We should be thoroughly examining our efforts and doing our best to improve them.
Matthew is the author of Chinese Communist Espionage, co-written with Peter Mattis. Join us next time with Dr. Roger Cliff, who authored a study for the Rand Corporation about how China intends to fight in the South China Sea if it ever comes to blows with the United States.
This episode was written and produced by Jack Murphy with additional assistance by Rod Rodriguez. Be sure to leave us a review on Apple Podcast and follow us on Twitter at StripesMMPod. Go to stripes.com and use promo code podcast to get 50% off your digital subscription. That's 50% off when you use promo code podcasts. Be sure to share this podcast. We grow by word of mouth. So like, listen, subscribe, and share. I'm Rod Rodriguez.
I'm Jack Murphy.
And we'll see you at the next episode. Want to keep your dollars and cents? Then download the Cents app from the Office of Financial Readiness. That's Cents, S-E-N, money sign, E, to save for retirement, build credit, create a spending plan, or buying a home. You can't do any of those things without money. So if you have cents, you'll download the Cents app. That's S-E-N, money sign, E, today. And be sure to follow at DoD FinRed on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube.